In the year 80 AD, Rome unveiled what it considered its greatest monument. The Colosseum gates swung open and 50,000 Romans screamed like a single beast. Somewhere beneath that roar, a young woman lay trapped inside a wooden sculpture shaped like a cow, her body locked in place by bronze hinges and iron clamps. She had committed no crime, raised no sword against the empire. Her only purpose was to act out an ancient myth, one where a queen is violated by a bull while the crowd watches every second. When the animal charges onto the sand, fathers hoist their sons above the mob so they won't miss a thing. When the screams begin, nobody looks away. The entire stadium laughs. Most of what Hollywood taught us about gladiators and honor is pure fiction. The Colosseum was never a sports arena. It was a machine built to convert human suffering into spectacle on an industrial scale. Roman engineers once flooded the entire floor to recreate naval wars where real soldiers in real armor drowned and never resurfaced. After sunset, condemned prisoners were smeared in tar, chained to wooden stakes, and set ablaze to serve as living torches so the audience could keep eating and chatting under the glow of burning flesh. None of this was the madness of a rogue emperor. It was government policy, a calculated system designed to make cruelty feel as ordinary as weather. Behind the spectacle lay an entire economy. You needed bodies, so you built training camps. Slaves, war prisoners, even desperate free citizens signed away their lives in contracts that turned them into property. They were branded like cattle, drilled by specialists and sorted into combat styles the way a restaurant sorts a menu. One school produced heavyweights with tower shields and full helmets. Another churned out fast, lightly armored killers. Armorers mass-produced gear. Sand dealers supplied the exact grain that absorbed blood best. Sign painters slapped advertisements on city walls, announcing how many pairs would fight, on what date, for whose honor, with a promise at the bottom that money was no object. The munus, the debt to the dead, had become an industry. Landowners sold their prisoners into the pipeline. Brokers traveled to the edges of the empire, scouting muscle. Physicians tested diets designed to keep fighters heavy enough to absorb punishment, but limber enough to perform. What started as a whispered debt to the dead had become a screaming contract with the living mob. The equation was brutal and never changed. More blood equals more love. But human bodies alone couldn't satisfy a city of 1 million appetites. At some point, somebody asked a question that would reshape the natural world. What if the crowd could watch Rome conquer not just people but every living creature on earth? That question gave birth to the Venetians, the great animal hunts. When Titus inaugurated the Colosseum around 80 CE, ancient chroniclers claimed 9,000 animals were slaughtered across a 100-day festival. Lions, leopards, bears, crocodiles, rhinoceroses. The tallies read less like a celebration and more like a casualty report from a war against nature itself. Pulling that off required a supply chain that stretched across continents. In North Africa, hunting teams dug massive pits and disguised them with branches to trap lions. They strung nets across migration corridors, wide enough to catch entire prides. Elephants were herded into wooden corrals, using walls of fire and jabbing spears. Along the Nile, hippos were harassed out of the river into cages half submerged in the shallows. Every single capture was a dice roll with death. Hunters were crushed under hooves, shredded by claws, dragged beneath the water, and never seen again. But the paychecks were enormous, because Rome bought suffering in bulk. Then came the transport. Caravans hauled caged animals to port cities along the coast. The creatures were loaded onto reinforced cargo ships with custom-built holding pens. Crossing the Mediterranean was a nightmare for everything on board. Animals starved mid-voyage. Legs snapped in storms. Panicked beasts thrashed until they broke their own necks against iron bars. Roman accountants logged these losses the same way they logged rotten grain shipments. Just overhead, just the cost of running the show. Once the ships docked in Italy, the survivors went into holding compounds outside Rome. Keepers burned through mountains of meat, fodder, and fresh water every single day. Each day an animal breathed was money evaporating. Logistics teams planned hunts down to the hour. On the morning of a major hunt, handlers drove animals through underground tunnels into the labyrinth beneath the Colosseum floor. Massive elevators powered by teams of slaves hoisted cages up to hidden trapdoors. When those doors cracked open, a lion didn't stroll out. It erupted into a blazing white oval of sand surrounded by 50,000 screaming humans. The audience didn't come just to watch animals bleed out. They wanted domination turned into theater. Hunters with javelins taunted wounded beasts. Archers picked off animals from elevated platforms. Sometimes unarmed prisoners were shoved into the sand first as appetizers. The whole production was imperial branding at its most visceral. Wherever Rome's armies marched, every creature that walked or crawled or swam ended up in chains, dying on Roman sand for Roman applause. Nobody in those stands calculated what they were actually destroying. When you butcher thousands of apex predators and rare species generation after generation, they vanish from the map. Lions that once prowled the hills outside Carthage became ghosts. Elephants that had once filled the forests of North Africa disappeared entirely from regions they'd roamed for millennia. No Remang ever measured biodiversity loss. They measured cheering. They measured political loyalty. They measured how long the emperor could keep smiling from his private box. And loyalty is where the real economics of the arena snap into focus. Emperors had a problem that never went away. 1 million Romans needed to stay fed and distracted, or the streets would burn. Grain handouts helped. Public baths helped. But nothing delivered like the games. A lavish festival could dissolve a riot overnight. A boring emperor could purchase adoration simply by announcing a week of hunts, capped with a final day of gladiatorial combat. The imperial treasury bankrolled hunters, trainers, shipbuilders, carpenters, animal handlers, architects, and gravediggers. The arena wasn't wasteful spending. It was a jobs program fueled by death. The emperor stopped being just a ruler. He became a showrunner. He reviewed the lineup. He approved how many days, how many fights, how many exotic kills. He sat in his gilded box directly facing the masses. When he rose and lifted his hand, 50,000 heads snapped toward him in unison. That single moment was worth more than any military victory. It reminded every soul in the building who held the switch between life and death on that sand. Stay quiet, and someone might wonder why. Cheer loud enough, and you disappeared safely into the ocean of obedient faces. A typical festival day followed a rhythm the crowd knew by heart. Mornings opened with animal hunts and exotic displays. Impossible creatures ripped from the edges of the known world, paraded, and then destroyed. But sandwiched into the midday hours, while spectators were still settling in with food and gossip, came something far worse than any hunt. The executions. Rome didn't waste a death by making it quick. That would be boring. The Roman solution was the fatal charade. Instead of a clean killing, condemned prisoners were cast as characters in myths the audience already knew. The script was written in advance. The ending was always death, but not just any death. The prisoner had to die the exact way the mythological figure died in the original story. The crowd wasn't watching to find out if the victim would survive. They were watching to see how faithfully the legend would be performed using a real human body. Ancient poets recorded one of these living nightmares. A man costumed as Orpheus, the legendary musician who could tame wild beasts with his voice, was placed in the center of the arena holding a lyre. Docile animals wandered around him. The audience nodded along, recognizing the story. Orpheus, the gentle poet. Then a hidden gate opened, and a pack of bears charged across the sand. They ripped the man apart, while his prop instrument lay splintered beside him. The crowd roared with laughter at the punchline. The man who was supposed to charm beasts was devoured by them instead. Another spectacle involved the myth of a boy who flew on wings of wax. Engineers rigged a launching mechanism high above the arena floor. A condemned man was fitted with crude artificial wings and paraded before the crowd as the legendary flyer. Then the device hurled him downward onto the sand or onto concealed blades below. The myth said the boy fell from the sky. In the Colosseum, that fall wasn't metaphor. His shattered body was the final act. These productions demanded real craftsmanship. Tailors stitched costumes and masks. Woodworkers built stage props and mechanical rigs. Stagehands rehearsed the exact sequence of opening gates, releasing animals, and clearing corpses before the next act. Every beat was choreographed, so the audience experienced surprise, then shock, then the satisfaction of a story completed. A savage narrative arc. Beginning, middle, death. The people strapped into these roles weren't all murderers and traitors. Many were petty thieves, runaway slaves, political dissidents, people condemned for worshiping the wrong god. The moment a judge stamped them as condemned, their identities ceased to exist. They became raw material for scripts. And the more inventive the killing, the more likely the man who paid for the games would be remembered for a generation. In a world without cameras or recordings, you carved your legacy into public memory by staging deaths so horrifying nobody could ever forget them. That hunger for spectacle nobody had seen before produced what might be the most disturbing performance ever whispered about in the Roman world. The reenactment of the bull and the queen. The myth told of a queen on a distant island cursed with an unnatural obsession for a bull. In the legend, a craftsman built her a hollow wooden cow so she could climb inside and trick the animal. The result of that union was the birth of a monster. Every Roman knew this story. At some point, a games producer decided that simply telling this story wasn't enough. He wanted to stage it with a real woman and a real bull. According to later accounts, a hollow wooden cow was constructed with working hinges and an interior cavity. A condemned woman was chained inside. The structure was wheeled onto the arena floor. The instant the crowd saw it, they erupted. They screamed the mythical queen's name. This was no longer theater. This was a countdown. The sources split on exactly what happened next. Some say a bull was goaded toward the structure and provoked into mounting and crushing it while the woman shrieked inside. Others suggest that blades were built into the frame so that any impact from the animal would drive iron into her body. However it played out, the purpose was identical. Transform a myth about divine wrath into a real-time sentence of torture and death performed for applause. Consider how many hands built that single moment of cruelty. Carpenters spent days shaping and assembling wood. Metal workers forged hinges, latches, and concealed blades. Painters decorated the exterior so the crowd would instantly recognize the prop. Guards dragged the condemned woman from a cell beneath the arena, restrained her, and locked her into position. Animal handlers had starved and beaten the bull for days to guarantee aggression on command. Dozens of professionals touched that machine before the gates swung open. Not one of them refused. All of it fed into the vast machinery humming beneath the arena floor. Under the Colosseum, a maze of corridors stretched in every direction. Cages lined the walls. The air was thick with sweat, animal waste, and terror. Above, the sand concealed trapdoors, ramps, and elevator platforms. Between events, teams of slaves raked the surface clean and spread fresh sand over whatever was left behind. Physicians stood by with red-hot irons to cauterize the wounds of gladiators valuable enough to save. Everyone else was dragged to the spoliarium, stripped of anything worth reselling and discarded like waste. Every minute of every show, someone was running the numbers. How many prisoners remained in holding? How many animals survived the morning session? Could any be recycled for the afternoon? How many work crews were needed to strike the set and rebuild before the next execution? And hovering above all of it, the emperor's accountants calculated whether this festival was generating enough public loyalty to justify the expense. Bread and circuses wasn't a slogan. It was a line item in the imperial budget. If something inside you recoils at all of this, then you understand exactly why this history matters. We're not just cataloging atrocities. We're dissecting a system. The funeral games and the animal massacres were just the foundation. The mythological executions were just the warm-up act. Rome wasn't satisfied with killing on dry ground. They wanted to remake entire wars on open water with real warships and real soldiers inside an arena built over a drained lake bed. When Rome wanted to prove it owned the ocean, it didn't launch a navy. It turned a faucet. Beneath the Colosseum, engineers had threaded hidden channels directly into the city's water supply. For occasions deemed spectacular enough, crews evacuated the underground chambers, plugged every drain, and unleashed the flow. The killing floor, where gladiators and beasts bled out every other week, transformed into an artificial lake. Roman writers describe full-scale naval battles fought on this indoor sea with thousands of men crammed onto warships and commanded to slaughter each other while the audience sat above them completely dry, completely entertained. One account puts the number at 3,000 fighters in a single staged battle. These weren't trained Marines. Most were prisoners of war, condemned men, slaves with nothing left to trade but their lives. A handful were dangled the promise of freedom if they survived. The rest understood there was no door on the other side. They were handed weapons, herded onto boats, and shoved out into water that could swallow them the moment they stumbled, because the armor strapped to their bodies turned into an anchor the instant it got wet. From the upper seats, the spectacle was magnificent. Ships collided, oars splintered against hulls. Bodies tumbled overboard and vanished beneath the surface. The crowd heard battle cries, splintering wood, the slap of water against desperate hands. From that distance, the men below were pieces on a board game. But on the water, every second was a calculation between fighting and drowning. The basin was shallow enough to stand in some places. In others, an unexpected dip in the floor could pull a panicking man under before he could scream. Staging these water wars demanded the same merciless precision as everything else the arena produced. Architects had to engineer a basin that could flood and drain on a tight schedule. Gangs of slaves operated the water gates by hand. Ship crews inspected hulls, counted weapons, and tied off rigging. Once the killing ended, the water had to disappear fast, because the same arena might need dry sand for a beast hunt or a gladiator bout by the end of the week. Behind the grandeur of Rome's indoor ocean, it was still just another line on a production calendar. For the men fighting on those boats, hope was a prop written into the script. Some were coached to shout rehearsed pleas for mercy at the emperor's box. Others were told that bravery might earn them a pardon. The crowd knew better. The Senate knew. The emperor certainly knew. But spectacle demands a narrative. And this was the story they sold. War, surrender, the beautiful lie that courage could rewrite the ending. When the last man standing was claimed, by whichever side the emperor favored, the dead were fished from the water or left to surface as the basin emptied. Workers hauled corpses aside. Ships were towed into storage. The arena floor reappeared under fresh sand, scrubbed clean, ready for the next scheduled atrocity. The takeaway was impossible to miss. Even the sea itself could be summoned, exploited, and dismissed at Rome's convenience. If the naval spectacles represented cruelty at its most colossal, what came next targeted something far more personal, the Roman ideal of womanhood. In speeches and law courts, Roman moralists celebrated a very specific image. The virtuous matron, modest, homebound, devoted to wool and children and silence. That was the version sold in public. But inside the arena, a completely different female figure was put on display. Armed, exposed, bleeding for applause. Female gladiators were real. Latin texts sometimes call them gladiatrices. They were rare enough to feel transgressive, and that rarity was exactly the point. These women were typically booked as novelty attractions during special events. They fought other women, wild animals, or male dwarfs in pairings deliberately designed to provoke shock and amusement. Ancient sources suggest their armor was stripped down by design. Lighter protection, tighter fittings, key pieces removed entirely, so their bodies became as much a part of the performance as their swords. The fights were marketed as forbidden spectacle. The audience came for violence and stayed for degradation. Picture the hypocrisy. Senators who delivered lectures about female virtue during daylight could sit beneath the emperor's canopy after dark and watch enslaved women fight for survival in outfits designed to humiliate them. When a female combatant stumbled or took a blade, the reaction from the crowd wasn't pity. It was hunger. Her suffering fed the bloodlust and the voyeurism simultaneously. The arena kept pushing against every boundary it could locate. Water, gender, species, social class. But the most disturbing line it ever crossed was the one between darkness and human flesh. The Latin phrase tunica molesta means the troublesome tunic. It was a garment designed not to protect, but to destroy. During certain Roman executions, condemned prisoners were dressed in clothing that had been soaked in pitch, oil, or resin. Once the crowd was settled and the signal dropped, the tunic transformed the person wearing it into a living flame. The historian Tacitus describes what Nero did after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. He blamed Christians and invented punishments to match his cruelty. Some were sewn into animal hides and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified. Others were turned into human lanterns. Tacitus says they were set ablaze in Nero's private gardens to serve as lighting while guests strolled the grounds after sunset. This wasn't about swift justice. The method was chosen specifically to drag out the agony and extend the viewing experience for as long as the flames held. The same principle migrated into public festivals. When darkness fell and the games continued, rows of condemned prisoners could be lashed to stakes along the arena's perimeter, coated in accelerant and ignited. The crowd could see the sand clearly. They could see each other's faces. They could see the emperor in his box. All of it illuminated by screaming human beings wrapped in fire. The preparation behind these living torches was its own quiet horror. Someone had to sew the garments. Someone had to restrain the prisoners. Someone had to brush the pitch onto cloth and skin, test whether the flames would catch reliably, and stand close enough to ignite the first torch without catching fire themselves. Someone had to endure the opening seconds of screaming before the sound dissolved into the ambient noise of cheering, flute music, and announcers introducing the next act. By this point, the architecture of a festival day comes into focus. Mornings offered variety and wonder. Exotic beasts from the edge of the world, strange combat pairings, water spectacles. Evenings belonged to the slow amber glow of burning bodies. But the most coldly efficient cruelty was reserved for the Gage. Middle of the day, when the sun sat directly overhead and the crowd's stomachs were growling. Romans had a name for it, the Meridiani, the midday show. This was execution hour. While spectators chewed on bread and figs, unarmed prisoners and condemned criminals were marched onto the sand to die in ways that traded artistry for speed. No mythological costumes, no elaborate stage machinery, just killing men thrown to starved animals with no weapons and no ceremony. Others forced to fight each other without armor until one remained standing, and then that survivor was cut down too. Some were tied to posts and used as live targets for archers running drills. The midday executions weren't spectacle. They were waste management. The empire had a backlog of condemned bodies, and the arena was the processing facility. The crowd's energy at noon was different from the electric charge of the morning or the fever of the closing bouts. Some spectators barely watched. Others observed with a flat, detached curiosity, the way someone might glance at a street musician and keep walking. Children grew up seeing this as completely ordinary. Workers used the break to stretch, gossip, and scan the stands for familiar faces. Death at midday wasn't an event. It was ambient noise. If a victim screamed or begged, sections of the crowd booed and yelled for them to die with more dignity. Bravery earned a nod, but never a rescue. Cowardice earned jeers. The lesson saturated every row of the stadium, especially for slaves and lower-class spectators sitting in the cheap seats at the top. The state can do this to you whenever it decides. And when it does, your neighbors will watch while eating lunch. What followed those executions might be the most quietly horrifying detail of all. When the blood began to crust on the sand and the next act needed a clean stage, workers sprinted out with rakes, hooks, and shovels. Their destination was a room every arena had. In Latin, it was called the spoliarium. The spoliarium was where the dead were dragged, stripped, and inventoried. Armor was unbuckled and set aside for the next fighter. Weapons were collected and resharpened. Jewelry, clothing, anything of value was confiscated as property of the state or pocketed by the crew. If the corpse had been a gladiator, his gear might be cleaned and strapped onto a replacement by nightfall. If he had been a condemned criminal, whatever rags he wore became someone else's profit. Either way, the body itself was garbage to be hauled out of sight before it slowed the schedule. But here is the detail that stays with you. Multiple sources describe arena attendants pressing red-hot irons against fallen bodies to confirm they were actually dead. Imagine lying on the sand, shattered, the crowd's attention already drifting to whatever comes next. You feel consciousness slipping. Maybe you think the worst is over. Then hands seize your limbs. You're dragged across the grit, leaving a wet trail behind you. In a chamber just off stage, someone pushes a glowing metal rod against your skin. If your body doesn't react, they mark you as finished. They drive a hook through your ankle or shoulder and haul you away. But if you flinch, if your nervous system fires one last involuntary jolt, your reward isn't a doctor. It's another blade, another strike, or being dragged back out onto the sand to be killed properly in front of an audience that has already forgotten your face. Even the border between living and dead had to serve the production schedule. Think about what that job did to the workers. Day after day, their role was to stab, burn, and drag bodies so the show could stay on time. They weren't executioners performing a single deliberate act. They were stagehands forced to make split-second decisions about whether someone deserved another blow, not based on justice, but because the next event needed an empty floor. By the time the empire hit its stride, Rome's entertainment industry faced an unexpected crisis. It was running out of ways to shock people. Gladiator duels had been done 1,000 times. Animal massacres were routine. Naval battles, mythological executions, Human Torch's lunchtime slaughter, all of it had already been staged, applauded, and forgotten. The crowd still filled the seats, but the men designing the programs lived in constant terror of one thing: becoming predictable. And when an audience addicted to escalation starts feeling bored, the worst ideas in the room suddenly start sounding brilliant. One of those ideas drifted in from beyond the borders of the empire. Greek and Roman authors told a story about the Persian king Artaxerxes and a condemned man named Mithridates who was punished in a way that read like a fever dream. They called it the boats. History remembers it as scaphism. According to Plutarch, the prisoner was wedged between two hollowed-out boats with only his head and extremities exposed. He was force-fed a mixture of milk and honey until his stomach swelled and his body rejected it. Then his exposed skin was coated in more honey, and he was left in direct sunlight beside stagnant water. The insects arrived on schedule. Flies, wasps, beetles, entire swarms, drawn by the sweetness, crawled across every inch of exposed flesh. He couldn't shift enough to brush them away. His own waste accumulated beneath him, attracting still more vermin. The accounts claimed the man lingered like this for days. consumed alive by countless tiny jaws, while his heart kept beating. Whether every detail survived intact or grew in the retelling, the intention is unmistakable. This wasn't execution. It was the transformation of a single human death into a process so slow it became its own event. As far as surviving records tell us, Rome did not formally stage this as a Colosseum attraction. There's no documented case of the full boat punishment being performed on the arena floor. But Romans devoured these stories. They circulated them. They cited them as the ultimate expression of calculated cruelty. They were captivated by the idea that someone somewhere had figured out how to stretch one death across an entire week. Even if this version remained a Persian legend, the empire had its own catalog of prolonged exposure punishments. Criminals spiked to posts and abandoned for days. Bodies smeared with substances designed to attract predators. Condemned prisoners left in public squares as walking warnings until their bodies gave out. The most visible symptom of the empire's decay wasn't a borrowed technique. It was a homegrown emperor. Commodus ruled from 180 to 192 CE, and the sources paint him as a man who wanted to be worshipped as a god and celebrated as a gladiator simultaneously. Previous emperors had participated in the arena symbolically. They gave the signal. They pardoned a brave fighter. They tossed coins into the stands. Commodus obliterated that boundary. He didn't just oversee the games. He put on armor, grabbed weapons, and walked onto the sand as a performer. He styled himself as Hercules reincarnated. He draped himself in lion pelts, hefted a massive club, and commissioned statues portraying him in that mythic pose. But his arena heroics were stage-managed down to the last detail. He killed wild animals from elevated platforms, safely out of reach. Writers like Cassius Dio describe him standing on a raised walkway methodically spearing bears, lions, and leopards that had been starved, chained or penned so tightly they couldn't fight back. In one notorious session, he reportedly killed 100 bears in a single day, not by confronting them, not by entering their space, but by standing at a comfortable distance and stabbing them one by one while the entire city watched. It was industrial slaughter repackaged as personal heroism. He also took pleasure in using razor-edged arrows to sever the heads of ostriches mid-stride, then holding the dripping heads toward the senator's section, making sure every man in a toga understood the implicit threat. That blade could aim higher any time he wished. This wasn't mere ego. It was ruinously expensive. Commodus billed the state astronomical fees for every appearance. He declared that each time he set foot in the arena as a gladiator, his compensation should match the pay of an entire Roman legion. The treasury hemorrhaged gold to fund his costumes, his private hunts, his animal stockpiles, and his endless schedule of performances. Commerce ground to a halt during his shows. The city bent around one man's obsession with performing his own greatness. The message radiating from all of this was toxic. An emperor was supposed to govern, adjudicate, and command. Commodus chose instead to cosplay as a butcher and demand applause for it. When the most powerful man in the known world turns himself into a theatrical killer, slaughtering defenseless animals for cheers, what does that reveal about the entire structure beneath him? It reveals that every justification the system ever offered has collapsed. Honoring the dead, training soldiers, appeasing the gods. All of it stripped away. What remains is raw, undisguised appetite. Under rulers like Commodus, another evolution accelerated. Animals stopped being simple weapons and became trained instruments of prolonged death. The legal phrase damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, appears throughout Roman legal codes and literary accounts. It was an official sentence handed down by courts. A judge could condemn you to the sword, to the cross, to fire, or to the beasts. The beast handlers known as bestiarii didn't just release predators into the arena and hope instinct did the work. They engineered the outcome. They starved animals for days to manufacture desperation. They beat them to amplify aggression. They conditioned them to navigate tunnels and gates, to burst into blinding daylight before a wall of noise. Some animals eventually learned to associate the arena with feeding, because every single time the gate opened, a human body was waiting on the other side. When organizers wanted a fast, visceral kill, they flooded the sand with multiple large predators, targeting a single unarmed victim with nowhere to run. Death came in seconds. When they wanted drama, they released one animal at a time, sometimes smaller ones. Or they gave the condemned just enough of a chance to scramble, climb, or duck behind a prop. A prisoner might claw his way up a fake cliff, while a panther circled below, swiping and lunging. From the stands, that was tension and entertainment value. On the sand, it was terror measured in heartbeats. Some animals survived their first performance. If a beast made it through a show without escaping or dying of its injuries, handlers patched its wounds and stored it for next time. Over seasons, this created lions and bears, whose entire existence consisted of cages and killing. Their whole reality was captivity, starvation, pain, and the deafening roar of thousands every time a gate lifted. The crowd understood this. That was part of the attraction. They weren't just watching a wild predator. They were watching something that human hands had deliberately corrupted into a biological machine of suffering. An instrument with a pulse and teeth. And then into this grinding apparatus walked a new category of victim. When Christianity first surfaced in the Roman world, it was simply one more cult in a marketplace overflowing with them. But early Christians refused to make sacrifices to the traditional gods or acknowledge the emperor's divine authority. That refusal converted a private belief into a public crime. During moments of imperial crisis, plagues, fires, military defeats, officials pointed at this stubborn sect and blamed them for provoking divine anger. The punishment pipeline led straight to the arena floor. What made Christian victims different from ordinary condemned prisoners was documentation. Many believers wrote accounts of their own impending deaths, or had their stories recorded by fellow members of the faith. That gives us a more granular and emotionally vivid picture of how these particular executions were produced. In cities like Carthage, martyrs such as Perpetua and Felicity were dragged before public games, paraded in humiliation, savaged by animals, and finally dispatched by a swordsman once the audience had extracted enough entertainment from their suffering. The organizers planning these events didn't view them as sacred or meaningful. To a Roman games producer, Christians were just another shipment of condemned bodies to fill a time slot. But the writers within the Christian community saw something else entirely. A grotesque inversion of their faith, staged as mass entertainment. Over decades, patterns crystallized. Executions were timed to coincide with public festivals and religious holidays. On days honoring deities associated with fire, some Christian prisoners were burned. On festivals celebrating divine hunts, victims were torn apart by animals. The thematic matching was deliberate. The crowd experienced it as clever programming. The condemned experienced it as a weaponization of the calendar itself. From the comfort of the upper rows, you could buy roasted nuts, settle your children on your lap, and watch a column of prisoners shuffled onto the sand in plain tunics. To the announcer, they were the afternoon segment. To the scheduling team, they were a line item between the beast hunt and the closing gladiator bout. To the condemned themselves, they were about to become the founding stories of a world religion. Centuries later, their deaths would be whispered in prayer and painted on catacomb walls, while the names of every festival planner and arena manager dissolved into absolute nothing. The most unsettling element isn't the violence. It's the organization. There were job titles for every stage of the process. The official who read the sentence, the guard who fastened the chains, the handler who inspected the gate mechanism, the announcer who bellowed the prisoner's crime to 50,000 spectators, the backup executioner who stepped in with a blade if the animal didn't finish the job cleanly enough. Each person performed their role so the audience could enjoy what the organizers called a smooth experience. This is where the mirror swings toward us. You and I exist in a world that has officially outlawed the arena. No emperor feeds prisoners to lions in a stone amphitheater at the center of any modern capital. But the underlying mechanism, suffering packaged as content, pain converted into a product, an audience sitting safely in the dark and watching, is not as far behind us as we'd like to believe. Today, violence reaches us through glass instead of sand. Fights, accidents, war footage, public humiliation. All of it recorded, uploaded, shared, replayed millions of times. Algorithms perform the exact function Roman emperors once performed. They select, they arrange, they deliver the most engaging content to your eyes over and over again. Their objective is not to make you wiser or kinder. Their objective is to keep you watching. Here is the question that matters. If the Colosseum existed right now, exactly as it did 2,000 years ago, and a notification appeared on your phone reading, "Live Imperial Games, 50,000 watching now," what would you do? Would you tap it? Would you watch just one clip, just to see how bad it really was? Would you stay longer than you'd ever admit, telling yourself it was just curiosity? The Romans didn't wake up one morning as monsters. They drifted one small step at a time into a reality where it felt perfectly normal to laugh at a woman screaming inside a wooden cow, to cheer while an emperor speared his 100th chained bear, to eat lunch while unarmed men were torn to pieces 10 rows below, to read by the light of burning human bodies and complain the flames weren't bright enough. The arena didn't just reflect Roman values. It shaped them. This is not a catalog of random horrors. It is a blueprint for what any civilization becomes when it decides that cruelty, if sufficiently organized and entertaining, is acceptable. If you've followed this story from the first gate to the last body dragged from the sand, you're not here for cheap shock. You're trying to understand something ugly and essential about what our species is capable of building when no one says stop. The more people confront this side of the past, the harder it becomes to lie about what civilization actually looks like when the mask comes off. Stay curious, stay sharp, and never stop asking yourself, when you look at the worst things human beings have ever done, if I had been in those stands, would I have watched?